Hello, and welcome to Arts Alive Books. My name is Jerry Smith. Joining me tonight is Liverpool writer Luca Veste, who will be talking about his latest book, The Dying Place. Later, we're also going to be speaking to local author Anthony Schumacher about his inspiration for his first book, Rear View Mirror. But first of all, Luca Veste, welcome.
Thank you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your new novel, The Dying Place?
It's the second in the Murphy and Rossi series that I've been writing. It's about two detectives who work in Liverpool North. This second novel is about a body's found in West Derby outside of a church of a young boy, about 17, 18, and it's about how that boy came to be there. As the book progresses, you realise that there are numerous young teenage boys who have been taken off the streets and who are being kind of, tortured into being better members of society. And the generation clashes is what the book is mainly about.
I see. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into crime writing?
Well, I first started writing, it was only about 4 or 5 years ago. I started writing short stories, and they were mainly like gangstery type of stories, which were like, the mean streets of Speak and things like that, and crime fiction was what I was writing because that was what I was reading a lot of. So I thought, when I was writing the short stories, I'll try and write a novel in the same kind of vein of the short stories that I was writing at the time. And I attempted to write a novel about a character called Shooter, who was based on my granddad's nickname, and he wasn't because he walked around with a gun, it was because he had 3 kids in 3 years. So the blokes at the pub used to call him Shooter. But I kind of had this idea for this gangster kind of guy who had this nickname, and I tried to write this novel, and it wasn't working, and I was reading the kind of crime fiction that I was reading was nothing like that, what I was writing. So I kind of scrapped that idea, and I started writing my first novel, which was Dead Gone, which was a lot more psychological based and a lot more thrillery type of based.
Mm. And who would you say are your kind of major influences, the people writing crime fiction in Britain today?
I mean, there are always the standards of Mark Billingham and Ian Rankin, Val McDermid, the real big selling ones who they're big selling for a reason because they're excellent writers. So I take a lot of inspiration from what they've done in that genre. But I also like the kind of more off mainstream type of writing. So I've got people like Steve Mosby or Helen Fitzgerald who are writing in the same kind of genre, but they do different things with it. So Steve Mosby is writing essentially what is crime fiction, but he writes, he focuses more on character and feelings and how he can make a reader feel as they're reading the book. And Helen Fitzgerald is more. She's just. It's hard to categorize her because she is ostensibly writing crime, but they're more real and more about like real people and what she does with their characters is she's very brave with what she does with her characters, and that was something I took on board a lot while I was writing the first book. In that I did things with my characters that a lot of mainstream kind of crime fiction doesn't do. Mm-hmm. So I had no odds with kind of killing a character off, who may have played a large role in the story. And I took inspiration from people like Helen Fitzgerald who will do that. She'll kill off her main character by the end, and you think, well, where are you going to go from there? And it's like, but it works because of the bravery there. You will go with it as a reader.
Yeah. You've got a bit of a dual career, don't you? Because at the same time as you're writing fiction, you're also a student at the University of Liverpool.
Well, I wrote my first book while I was in my first year, and I'm studying criminology and psychology at the University of Liverpool. In my first year, I decided, what would make this even harder would be to write a novel alongside my studies, because I'm sometimes stupid. But it kind of came from writing long essays and things like that. Was the kind of first writing I did. So I was taking the questions that were given as essays and then exploring them further, and then I found I have to cut them down because I'd write long soliloquies about these subjects that I was learning about. So it kind of grew from that, was what grew into the short stories, and that's where my first writing came from. But I kind of knew what I was going to do in my first year. I knew that I was going to take what I was learning in me studies, and then use that as fodder for me fiction. But in other ways, it's also, incredibly interesting subjects to learn about. Criminology and psychology are fascinating subjects to learn about. Psychology especially it covers many facets of all kinds of kind of things that can play a good role into fiction.
So you've clearly been drawing on your experience studying criminology and psychology at the university. And how much of the material that goes into the books is drawn from your experience of growing up in Liverpool?
I mean, the second book more than the first book. The first book was solely drawn on my studies. It's about a serial killer who's using psychological experiments to kill his victims. So I used a lot of things that I learned in my studies in that novel. But in the second book, it's a lot more about what I grew up and where I grew up. I grew up on a myriad of different council estates, and that kind of plays a large role in what the book's about. Is that every generation feels that they've got it worse than the next one coming behind them. So it kind of played a large role in what I was writing about, because I can sympathise with both, because I can see what teenagers today how they feel, and then how an older generation feels as well. I mean, it came from almost 30 years of conversations with me dad, of all we need to do to get rid of these scallies is to get in a van, go around and pick them up off the street and beat them up. And I was over the years of like, yeah, hang on a minute, if you did that though, how would that actually play out? And it's that feeling of like, well, from the outside looking in, they are all scallies, but it's not actually until you're one of them people yourself that you think, well, I'm not the same as that other person over there. I'm not the same as that person who's just robbed that person over there. I'm different. I feel like I have more different morals to that person. But from the outside, it looks like everyone is the same. That everyone is they're all baddies, and we're the good guys. And it was that kind of clash that interests me a lot. And in Liverpool, it is a city of contrast. It's a massive difference between, if you go north towards Crosby and Formby way, it's a massive difference from there to Norris Green or, Liverpool 8 or, and that clash is something that interests me as a writer, unbelievably, because that's where you get your good stories from. So that drew a lot on what I saw growing up, and the fact that, my peers were going different ways than what I wanted to go.
So what's going to happen next for the two detectives,
Well,
Murphy and Rossi?
Murphy and Rossi, I mean, it's a long run series. I mean, I've got another. I'm writing the third one at the moment. There'll be another two after that. Hopefully, they'll give me more time to write even more of them, because I've got lots of stories to tell about them. The two detectives that especially Murphy and is someone who I think has got a rich history behind. I've got a lot of stories I can tell using him, and Laura Rossi, who is Italian, which means I can draw on my own Italian background, is just fun to write, because I get to swear in Italian a lot in print, which is always fun.
So it's a 5-book series that's
At the
planned
moment.
initially, yeah.
At the moment, it's 5 books, but I hope it runs for a lot longer, because although there is a famous saying that no one's favourite book in a series is book 13, but I think I've got a lot of stories I can tell with these detectives, and I think I've got a lot of stories to tell about Liverpool as well.
And you've got another number of projects in the pipeline as well. You're working on various other things.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's always things you can do as a writer. There's always little pies you can have your finger in. So I write a lot of short stories. I do put together anthologies of short stories that include a large number of other writers, and I've been trying to get another one off the ground now, which we do for children's literacy charities. So the first 2 sold really well and raised a lot of money for charity. So that's something fun to do, because growing up, libraries especially were something that was incredibly important to me, because that's where I got my literature from. That was where I went to read books that I couldn't, just get.
Okay, thanks very much. That was Luca Veste talking about his second novel, The Dying Place. And Luca will be joining us later on in the show to talk about one of his favourite books. Before that, in the second part, Anthony Schumacher is going to be talking about his debut book. Welcome back. Anthony Schumacher has had a variety of jobs: policeman, stand-up comic, bin man, barman, builder and taxi driver. He popped into the studio recently to discuss his first book, the self-published Rear View Mirror, which is based on his experience as a taxi driver.
So your first book, Rear View Mirror, was that based on your experience as a taxi driver in Liverpool?
It was, it is, but there's a bit of a story how it came to be. I was working, I'd been a policeman, I'd been a cop for like 10 years, and I had this kind of weird midlife crisis when I was 40, and just come home one night and thought, no more, I'm not doing that anymore. And I was stumbling around looking for things to do, and I was a cab driver. I fell into cab driving because I was doing stand-up comedy badly. And I had this thing where I thought, well, if I can persevere at the stand-up comedy, and I needed this job with flexibility, and there aren't many jobs that give you that kind of flexibility, and a free car. So I thought, I'll have a go at cab driving, and that'll sort of give me the time and give me the experience of stand-up comedy. Then, almost within months of deciding that, I realised I was just sick of driving up and down the country. And then one night, I was driving a taxi, and a lot of cab drivers will know this feeling when you're just trundling around the city. It's just an awful night. And I got a job about 12:30 outside the Liverpool Empire, and I pulled up, and it was a lady. She got in the back of the cab, and we were chatting on the way back. And I just said to her, like kind of thing, we being out midweek, it wasn't a major thing. And she said, no, I've been to an awards ceremony in Manchester, a media awards thing. Now, through the comedy, I vaguely knew someone who was going to that media awards. She was quite surprised that I knew one of the guys who was getting nominated for the award, because, I suppose she just wasn't expecting a cab driver to be in that situation. Well, the one thing I would say is that cab drivers are amazing. There's so many different kinds of people driving cabs that you just wouldn't imagine. So I said to her, what do you do? And she said, I had a Liverpool magazine called Liverpool Confidential. And it was like affiliated, it still is, to Manchester Confidential, Leeds and a few other places. So I don't know what happened, but I had this kind of like weird flash in my head, and I said, I do a bit of writing. Didn't do any writing whatsoever. I had no experience of writing. I got a U in my English show level. I'm the worst, candidate for doing a bit of writing. And I just said to her, I do a bit of writing. And she said, what do you write about? And I said, things that happen in the cab. I was floundering looking for something to say, things that happen in the cab. Oh, that sounds interesting. Send me a few of them. So I went home that night and wrote the first one. And from that came Rear View Mirror, that first book. And what I used to do was I'd write these little kind of vignettes of about 1,000 words of the different people, because it opened my eyes to the millions of stories every single night happening all around you. And it opened my eyes to it that I hadn't really seen before, because I started looking for these stories. So I was writing these things, and Angie, the editor, taught me a lot about writing, and she taught me about, brevity, keeping things short, and which this answer doesn't prove I've learned anything from. But keeping things short and keeping it tight, and teaching me about story arcs and stuff. And over that probably about 18 months, I wrote a lot of columns for the magazine. And people started sending me emails saying, or tweets saying, have you got a book of them? I'd love a book of them, I'd like a little gift. So I self-published a book of them, I collated them all together and just threw it on Amazon. And that was it. That was, people just started buying it. So although it was my first book, it was kind of accidental. It wasn't really intended to be that, it was just one of them weird things where everything just lines up and it all comes together,
Tony, thanks for coming in today. It's been a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure, mate. Thank you.
Anthony Schumacher will be joining us again to discuss his new novel, The Darkest Hour, in a future episode of the show. But Luca Veste joins us again to talk about one of his favourite books, The Stand by Stephen King. Luca.
Well, yeah, The Stand, it's a classic that not a lot of people have read, apparently. But it's one of Stephen King's, I think, finest hours as a writer. It's essentially an apocalyptic fiction. It's, which is quite popular nowadays, but it was written, I think, in the late 70s, I think was when it was first released. It's about a flu virus that hits the world and kills off, I think it's 96% of the population. And it's about the survivors of that virus, Captain Trips, which is what it's named. And the survivors who were all drawn by the same dream to this Mother Abigail who lives in, the farmlands of Iowa or wherever it was. But it's essentially about these characters and how they came together, how they come together, and the ultimate battle of good versus evil, which is what the book is mainly about. So they have a character called Randall Flagg, who is the devil, basically, who is trying to, take over after this virus is hit. What I love about the book, though, it's his characters. It's in his characters. The characters he creates are just incredible. They have the inside they have so many different facets to their character that there's always someone that you can kind of relate to, but they also do bad things that you kind of don't relate to, and you think, well, why has he done that? Why has she done that? But it's Stephen King's finest hour, I think, as a writer. But the book started as a kind of it lived in my dad's room, and when I was about 7 or 8, I asked to read it. Now this book is about this big, it's huge. It's about 1,200 pages long. The complete and uncut edition is anyway. And it was the first adult novel I ever wanted to read. I don't know what. I don't think it was anything to do with the cover or anything like that. I think it was just it stood out to me. It lived in my dad's room, and it was that's where it stayed. I was never allowed to read it. And then I think it was around 11 or 12. My dad went, "Okay, you can read it now," and it kind of just blew my mind. It was just I couldn't believe that this fiction existed, because before that I was reading Enid Blyton, the Famous Five and Secret Seven. But this opened the possibilities for an unbelievable, storytelling experience as a reader, and it was like my first, thrust into adult life. It was like, oh my God! And then since then I've read it countless times. I always keep going back to it.
It's funny you should mention that. My first adult book was Pride and Prejudice. It might seem a long way away from the end of the world, until you remember a few years ago that book came out about Pride and Prejudice and zombies.
Yes.
There seems to be a lot of kind of apocalyptic. The genre seems to have grown so much in the last few years. Have you been observing that?
Yeah, I mean it's a genre of fiction I love to read. I don't know. I think it taps into that idea of having to be alone. How would I cope being alone? And I think that's a really important part of ourselves that we have to examine from time to time is that if the only thoughts that I can hear in my head, and I can't hear anyone else's thoughts because they're not speaking to me because I'm on my own, is how would I deal with that? And apocalyptic fiction, I think, taps into that. It also taps into the idea that, what would I do if the chips were down? Is that the reader likes to be able to put themselves in a victim's experience and work out, well, what would I do in that situation? But apocalyptic, I always wanted, growing up, I always had this idea of standing in the middle of like a city centre with no one else around and being able to plug a guitar in and just start playing and no one will be able to say anything. At 14 years of age, that sounds brilliant. But as I've grown older, it's more, well, what would I do without my family? What would I do without, my friends? Or, with not being able to communicate with the outside world, what would I do in myself? Would I be able to cope with that? And I think, the way they band together in The Stand, it's like a human trait that we all have to be together. It taps into that human nature of like, we don't just wander off into the woods and stay by ourselves. We are drawn together into societies. And that's something that always fascinated me. And as I've reread The Stand over the years, I've noticed more and more of these things as I read, and as I grow up, I notice more and more things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned Stephen King's characters as being one of the things that draws you to his fiction. He's an incredibly successful and influential writer. There must be something that he taps into that makes him so. What do you think it is?
I think if I knew that, I'd do it myself, and I'd be rich and famous like Stephen King. I think for me as a reader, I think he creates characters that will cross boundaries. So you can relate to characters, whoever they're from. He'll always put a nugget of relatability, you can relate to inside them. So it's that for me but he also creates situations and put these characters in them, which makes you go, oh, I wonder what's going to happen next and things like that. He's not just a horror writer, genre writer that we can dismiss. He's not. He's got so much more going on.
Yeah. Well, you talk about him very compellingly, and I hope you will be as successful as him one day. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, and see you next time. Bye-bye.